As expected, climate change does take us to a 2-degree world or warmer. Some of the incremental adjustments that we've spoken about for agricultural systems is just not going to be sufficient. What will be required will be transformation, so in what is farmed where and how it's farmed. What people are currently doing will just not be working in the future. This kind of transformation takes time to plan and to enable, and so it needs much longer-term thinking than some of the more coping strategies we've talked about in the previous lecture. Two of the key players in this longer-term thinking are, of course, governments and international agricultural organizations, whether they be research institutes or UN organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization. They really have a crucial role to play in thinking strategically about what's needed to anticipate these changes and what adaptation actions need to start happening now for those big changes in the future. I'll just give two examples to illustrate this. The first relates to national development planning and agriculture. Governments typically develop policies, quite long-term policies for economic growth, often 20 or 30 years in the future, with 5 and 10-year steps within that pathway. And government might be thinking in an agricultural context of investing in infrastructure to support enhancing particular types of commodities in agriculture, maybe in opening up new areas for agriculture, and maybe thinking about how to encourage shifting to different commodities. When developing this kind of long-term policy, government clearly needs to bear in mind possible future climate constraints. So, for example, Rwanda is very keen to expand its coffee production, and particularly high-value coffee that's going to bring in lots of export income. The problem with that is that many of the areas that are currently suitable for coffee in Rwanda might become unsuitable in the future. Coffee is very sensitive to temperature, and so if, as we expect, temperature globally increases by 2 degrees, locally maybe by 3 or 4 degrees, the Rwandan government's going to have to be thinking quite carefully about which parts of the country it opens up for new coffee production. It's clearly unlikely to be in existing areas, and so they need to have a strategy for opening up these new areas that are going to be high value, high suitability, maybe 15 or 20 years in the future when some of these coffee trees reach maturity and are ready for harvesting. The second example of this is actually from just down the road from where I live in the Cape. We have a large deciduous fruit industry in the Cape province of South Africa, and interestingly, particularly apples require very cold winters to stimulate the bud burst, the flowers starting to flower, and therefore on which then the fruit is dependent. What we've seen happening over the last 5 to 10 years is that the winters have been getting warmer, and the cold spells that are required to stimulate the bud burst are not happening as frequently, and so the crop failure or the low yield crop years are increasing, and apples are actually just becoming financially unsustainable. So in terms of longer term planning, the regional government needs to be thinking about what kinds of high value agriculture they're going to support if deciduous fruit, and particularly apples, become unsustainable in the future. The second big example that I want to cover relates to agricultural research. So commercial and government-funded research institutes are continually doing research to improve agricultural production, farming methods, and in particular looking at seeds that produce better crops, more resilient crops, and new livestock breeds that might be producing, for instance, with cows, better milk, and with chickens, better eggs, or even higher meat production per unit input of feed. What they need to be thinking about is, are they breeding now for today's climate or for the climates of the future? There's a lot of evidence that a lot of the breeding is not bearing in mind what the climate of the future might look like, and so a change in the long-term breeding strategies is needed to start to be diversifying the crop types and seeds and animal types that are available for the climates of the future in 20 or 30 years' time. Moving on to farmers themselves and how they might need to think in the longer term, commercial farmers and agribusiness clearly need to consider a number of factors when they're thinking about longer term climate change and how they might anticipate those in their business models. They need to be thinking a little bit like governments do about what the commodities will be that will be suitable in the land holdings that exist today. And so when a commercial farm is planning long term, it needs to be thinking about not what's suitable now, but what's suitable in 15 or 20 years' time when these crops, these perennial crops are coming to maturity. Farms perhaps should also be thinking about where they should buy new land or rent new land and for what crops. They maybe need to be thinking about how irrigation needs might change in a warmer climate and where's that water going to come from the irrigation. It might require longer term investment in changing their water infrastructure, building new on-farm reservoirs, or entering into negotiations with government around agricultural water supply, or maybe even thinking about purchasing land in areas where governments are planning large-scale irrigation schemes. For smallholder farmers in Africa, it's much harder for them to prioritize longer-term options given many of the short-term stresses that they experience and the lack of financial and other capitals they have for making longer-term investments. But it's really important that those working with farmers, for instance, agricultural extension officers, government programs, and where the focus is quite rightly on short-term gains, increasing economic returns on these small farms, they still need to be aware of how these shorter-term investments are going to play out in the long term, because the last thing we want is to be investing in supporting smallholder farmers to become more commercially oriented, to be having surplus produce on their farm that they can use to build up their financial capital, and then finding that these are what we call maladaptive in the longer term, that suddenly all these investments aren't fit for purpose in 10 or 20 years' time because the climate has changed. So the types of organizations that support farmers need to support research that will benefit these farmers both now and further in the future. There are, of course, some much bigger changes that might happen, and these bigger changes, if we're talking maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 degrees of warming and big changes in rainfall, might actually make current rural livelihoods unsustainable. That's going to mean that adaptation is, rather than changing farming systems, might lead to transitions into non-agricultural systems, so moving out of farming into some other form of income generation and livelihood support. Or at the very minimum, agricultural systems that are highly different. So, for instance, moving from rangeland into, for instance, wild animal farming. Government has a really important role in assisting with these transitions. They really need to be thinking now about what needs to be in place to enable some of these much larger transitions and transformations to take place. One area of this might be around regulatory changes, so enabling farmers to make these transitions without getting caught up in red tape that the current rules and regulations for current farming systems prevent them from changing. It might be also in investing in new economic activities in rural areas that create opportunities for people who are currently in the agricultural economy to move into different economic sectors. And then finally, one of the biggest adaptations when we have these sort of transformative changes, these limits to adaptation within agricultural systems, will inevitably be migration. People are going to move away from rural areas where agriculture is no longer viable and where there aren't any easy alternatives, probably to urban areas. And that kind of migration has to be anticipated and probably assisted by thinking about what are the economic developments that are going to be needed to support the livelihoods of people who are out-migrating from areas that are no longer, rural areas that are no longer productive into urban areas where there's a very different economy that needs to support their livelihoods. And within this sort of longer term enabling environment, creating the conditions that enable these transformations to happen, it's critical not to leave things too late. What we need to be doing is facilitating a gradual transformation so that there can be progressive changes that anticipate the end point of a totally transformed rural system, for instance.